Why did Christopher Marlowe opt for blank verse tragedy? A recent survey of how Shakespeare is viewed around the world tells us that he is widely viewed as perhaps the greatest literary figure of world history. His work continues to inspire and entertain ordinary people. It remains enormously well known and well liked around the world. The word Shakespeare in this context can be taken to encompass all the plays in blank verse that have come down to us from the 50-year period between 1561 and 1611. The best of these works stand unrivaled at the summit of our country's artistic achievement, one of the highest peaks of human culture. Well, with this in mind, you would assume that the ancient history of blank verse drama in England has been fully researched and recorded. Also, perhaps that students are given an outline of what happened in the mid-16th century for our writers to begin exploiting the elemental power that would energise the masterpieces that we now possess. It is not so. There is hardly a teacher or lecturer in the kingdom who could answer the simplest questions on this subject. Was there a single prototype play? If so, why is it never performed? What was it? Who wrote it? Was it received with enthusiasm or set aside and forgotten? Did it stay in the memory actively enough to inspire and influence all those famous plays right through to The Tempest? There was one such play, Thomas Norton and Thomas Sackville's The Tragedy of Gorboduc, and it is established that Christopher Marlowe, rather than William Shakespeare, used it to ignite a literary revolution with his own epoch-making play Tamburlaine. By the way, both of those writers were unborn until 3 years after this work was staged, so we're not concerned here with the authorship question. But even with that issue out of the way, England's theatre land in the 1580s was a whirl of complexity, experimentation and rising popularity, opening up to all classes, enjoyable, stimulating and for some people, though not the authors, very lucrative. Eventually this period of inventiveness coalesced into a form of verse drama modelled on a failed and neglected 26-year-old play in 5 acts of unrhymed verse written for Christmas entertainment by 2 legal colleagues at the behest of the Queen's chief advisor, Sir William Cecil. How did this improbable development come about? Christopher Marlowe opted into blank verse tragedy because he alone discerned in this vilified, undervalued, misunderstood, almost completely forgotten work some quality that no one else could see then and few can see even today. It was a kind of protoplasmic Shakespeare, just a smudge or a germ of primitive poetic and theatrical potential that might one day, in the hands of more gifted writers, realise almost impossible dreams of excellence in verse written for the stage. In everyday terms, Marlowe perceived what could be done if you were to use short lines, make them asymmetrical and get rid of rhyming. That's the winning formula at its simplest. When taken up again after sleeping for a generation, it worked like magic. Gorboduc itself was and is commonly treated as a total failure with no compensating quality. You will never find a work of literature with a greater discrepancy between its positive achievement and its negative reception by contemporary and subsequent critics. As festive entertainment, the play was a painful flop, and there's no shortage of commentators standing by to explain why. Here is a brief recital of negative attitudes which have come up repeatedly to denigrate this work. One of them tells us plainly that the two authors produced very nearly the dullest tragedy in the world, in itself a considerable achievement. Today, an actual descendant of Sackville describes it as the first and most boring tragedy of the English language. There's more. The monstrous Gorboduc was a maze of immense rhetorical sentences. They lie over the drama like the folds of a heavy toga impeding movement. Or again, the style of this old play is stiff and cumbersome, like the dresses of the times. There may be flesh and blood underneath, but we can't get at it. Again, a work whose vitality seems stifled by the stiff brocade of formal oratory. Or, this play is defective in imitating the best features of classical tragedy. It belongs more to antiquarianism than to live drama. It is cold and unrelieved. In short, it is a pretty sorry piece of work. Again, one of the dullest plays ever written in any land or age in any language. A dreadful example of what happens when the end-stop line predominates. Yet again, this English blank verse was all a clattering march of monotonous iambics, a parade of wooden soldiers unrelieved. This barrage of projectiles is outgunned in our own day by Sir Jonathan Bate, summoning heavy artillery in the same cause. He says this: William Hazlitt said something simple, important, and empirically true about the old play of Gorboduc, which is sometimes described as the first English tragedy. As a work of genius, he opined, it may be set down as nothing, for it contains hardly a memorable line or passage. The acidic tone of such reviewers, really, it's rather disturbing. Why are they so spiteful? Not content with disparaging the work, without much reflection, by the way, several critics must see this play dismissed as the worst thing ever written, with no redeeming features, monstrous, dreadful, dullest in any land or age or language, and worth nothing. Terms like these have no place in this context. They are serious and harmful errors which need to be refuted. Yet there's even worse to come. The only thing more harmful than annihilation by critics is to be ignored or forgotten, the ultimate form of dismissal. That was the sad fate of Gorboduc throughout the 26 long years separating it from Tamburlaine. And it's still the sad fate of it today. Virtually nobody has even heard of this play. Among the very few who have and who want history to be properly recorded, commentators are still not playing by the rules. They have a habit of vagueness, setting the play down merely as one of the first blank verse tragedies. And you may have noticed Sir Jonathan's blurry comment. It is sometimes described as the first English tragedy. Away with that kind of prevarication. Whatever you think of its quality, this play should be proudly paraded for what it is, the sole progenitor of the most successful genre in our national culture, perhaps in world literature. Let me put it plainly. In early 1561, English blank verse tragedy did not exist. By the end of 1561, it did. And by 1611, it had risen to the heights of unrivalled glory. There's no way of diminishing these historical facts. There can be no reason to keep on detracting from the role of the prototype play that initiated this wonderful process. Can you imagine any other nation neglecting an opportunity like this one for celebration? We cannot duck some of the charges. In itself, and as it stands, it is a tedious 3-hour watch. Faced with the task of writing a play, Norton and Sackville naturally turned to the great classical writers for inspiration and went straight back to Seneca. But they wanted something better than a mere translation from Latin. A word or two about Seneca. His 8 tragedies were written not for entertainment or even enactment, but as closet dramas, presenting exemplary characters in stories declaimed in long speeches. These persons will be characterised by means of rhetorical declamation, including artificial devices such as reiteration, periphrasis, and elaboration. Individuality and differentiation between characters counted for nothing. The overall style seems to us now to be rigid, formalistic and arid. Strict rules of form were de rigueur, specifically the use of verse throughout 5 acts involving choruses to describe, rather than play out, stories of horror and violence. Warfare and assassination were welcome, but only through reports from offstage. The unities, inherited from Aristotle, were to be observed. All action must take place within 24 hours, in one place, on a single theme without subplots. These are forbidding requirements. We must take stock of what was accepted and rejected by the 2 authors. For the record, they scorned any idea of closet drama, and they also disregarded the unities. They welcomed the use of verse over 5 acts with choruses. Their innovations were all to the good, but unfortunately Norton and Sackville persisted in the second-hand reporting of any activity, thereby losing the immediacy of warfare, violence and murder. And worst of all, overschooled in law and accustomed to the science of mooting, they loved grandiloquent rhetoric to excess. They failed to discard it for the modern stage. Thus, they may be said to have reformed and improved on Seneca as a model, but not quite as much as they should have done. But if strangulation by rhetoric is the main drawback, the fault suggests its own remedy. What if we were to shorten this play by diminishing the rhetoric? Could we not look inside the toga, the posh dress, the brocade, and see whether there is flesh and blood underneath? Now let's face the truth, you could never make a great enthralling play out of the chosen materials and methods, but at least we could remove some of the tedium and give any underlying poetry a chance to shine through. Marlowe must have perceived what the shortcomings were, but somehow he sensed beyond them a suggestion of rich potential, and he went ahead despite them. Could an abridged version, with some of the rhetoric pruned away, keep an audience awake and perhaps pick up any signals of the protoplasmic Shakespeare that Marlowe certainly intuited? Let's glance at the play. There's nothing wrong with the opening dialogue between mother and son. Of its kind, it is a masterpiece of exposition. This short scene whets the appetite efficiently by introducing 2 characters in the flesh and 2 more by reference. They're easy to place and remember. King Gorboduc, Queen Vidina and their two sons Ferrex and Porrex, who identify each other and their place within the family in the early speeches, my mother dear, my son, my father, my brother. And we're also informed of two important details. First, Vidina's strong preference for Ferrex over Porrex. And second, the king's foolish decision to divide the country quite unnecessarily, a development that favours Porrex over Ferrex. Yes, I know it's the same story as King Lear. None of this would send an audience to sleep. It is useful and enticing material, and all of it is conducted in fewer than 70 lines of verse. Oh dear, the contrast between this and what follows could hardly be greater. The second scene is a disaster from which no play could ever recover. By far the longest scene in the whole work, it consists of almost 400 lines distributed among another 4 characters, the king and 3 courtiers. What ensues could certainly be described as the heaviest theatrical narcotic ever administered in any land or age, in any language. Marlowe did not allow himself to be put off by this. Responding to the king's proposal to dismember England, Arostus uses up in argument 102 lines, Philander 98 and Eubulus 89. They are the longest speeches in the whole play, and they constitute most of Act 1. Unnecessary eloquence. This is the main drawback of the play, and its worst effect is to strangulate all the poetry with rhetoric. What needs to be done to this text is what the French poet Paul Verlaine recommended for French poetry and theatre when he said, as late as 1874, "Prends l'éloquence et tords-lui son cou." Grab hold of eloquence and wring its neck. This injunction was 3 centuries too late to save the French nation from Gorboduc-like strictures in tens of thousands of lines, but we won't go into it at this moment. Clearly what we need is for someone to go through the play, stripping out some of the repetitive rhetoric to expose what's underneath. It wouldn't be too difficult because there's so much rhetoric to go at. All it would have to do is to ensure that when you've clipped away a bunch of lines in the midst of a long oration, the sense still runs on as it should. Many people won't ever notice what you have done. No changes are permitted, just omissions. Wouldn't it be nice if someone took on this task in order to give Norton and Sackville's poetry some room to breathe? Then we might be able to judge its quality, if there is any. Here's a helpful pointer. Christopher Marlowe must have performed this exercise, at least subconsciously, and he liked what he saw underneath. Fear not, the job has been done. At this point, I think it's traditional for me to say, here's what I heard earlier. I've given it the working title of Hamlet's Grandfather. This is not a silly joke. Plans are already in place for a private reading of the newly abridged text. If, as I hope, it proves acceptable, dare I even say enjoyable, it shouldn't prove too difficult to get this experiment onto a good stage, perhaps in London or Canterbury. When this is done, bring on the national press and plenty of critics. I may well stop off at the inner temple of the Inns of Court and try to book the very room where the first performance of Gorboduc took place, if it's still there after much war damage. For the moment, we have insufficient time. You must take it on trust for the time being that there is more than a modicum of rather good poetry in Gorboduc. Now, even as I say that, Please don't expect full-throated poetic exuberance of the highest order. Not in 1561. Too many lines are indeed enstopped. This verse was written 40 years before Hamlet. Nevertheless, some of it is good enough not to be out of place in what we call early Shakespeare. Some of it is indistinguishable from that genre. Some of it actually is in the early Shakespeare canon because bits of it have been borrowed. I want to remind you that the theatre landscape post-Tamburlaine is awash with ancestral memories of Gorboduc, some broadly generic, others poignantly specific. The finest examples, as I have indicated elsewhere, are in Hamlet, with at least 3 major borrowings, including the smash and grab stealing of an entire scene. King Lear is an obvious rewriting of Gorboduc, with the Earl of Kent standing in for Eubulus, Cecil, Lord Polonius and Lord Burleigh, all of them chief advisors to a monarch. These 2 plays were written 45 years apart. Grandparental resonances, loud and soft, are everywhere in almost all of these plays, often strong enough to count as undeniable. The author of the Shakespeare canon seems to have kept a copy of the prototype play close at hand. One man, William Tiedemann, is bold enough to consider the possibility of restaging Gorboduc in full sometime soon. What he says is this: given a tolerant audience aware of its historical significance, Gorboduc might still be brought to life in the theatre today. Despite obvious weaknesses, there is a kind of classical purity and marmoreal strength about the first English tragedy. I wish I'd said that lovely last sentence. And it's not far from the protoplasmic Shakespearean germ that I've been referring to. Although Tiedemann is praising the organised Senecan quality of the play, while I'm after the opposite tendency, the humanity, beauty, roughness and freedom made flesh by Marlowe. Either way, I believe that Tiedemann may be a shade too optimistic, though the chances may improve when we put our abridged version to the test. The full story of poetic achievement here will have to be told elsewhere. We shall need lots of examples. But before this procedure gets underway, we need to run quickly through the history. Those 50 years, 1561 to 1611, divide pretty well into 25 years of total quietude, followed by 25 years of stratospheric propulsion. If I was Christopher Marlowe, I might describe this latter development as being with over-thwarting flames and raging shoots. Doesn't he love his long words? Let's not forget that we are dealing with extremely important material. Even if nothing changes, and it's my belief that the squalid reputation of the tragedy of Gorboduc can be raised, this play should be located on the highest pinnacle because of its historical role as the one and only precursor of English blank verse drama, and because of the success of the whole enterprise. And Christopher Marlowe should stand alongside, also on high. When you sing the praises of Gorboduc, you sing the praises of Christopher Marlowe, the most important figure in the whole enterprise. This modest play began life unobtrusively as the quietly beating heart of a new tradition, which first enabled and then sustained the 50 or 60 blood-related plays commonly referred to as England's Renaissance drama. Its gentle underlying pulsation remains detectable continuously right through to the epilogue of The Tempest, that remake of Dr. Faustus in 1611. I intend to get this play published and performed, at least in time for the year 2061. It's not all that far away, only about 3 decades. Please regard this as the first call for conference papers. By then, this historical landmark will have been in existence for half a millennium, half of 1,000 years. Gaudeamus igitur. Let us therefore rejoice.